Now, before we get into the texts that we're going to cover, texts like the offering of Isaac and the flood and the conquest of Canaan, there has to be at least a little bit of an admission that this is a difficult text. First, we're going to deal with the offering of Isaac, but all of these are in some ways difficult texts. Now, specifically here, if I was to hear today that someone killed their child and claimed that God told them to do it, I would outright dismiss their claim that God had told them to do that. And yet here, when we deal with the biblical text, when we deal with Genesis, I don't dismiss the idea that God commanded Abraham to offer his son as a burnt offering. And why do I make that distinction? God's command was to Abraham. The command is found in Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 19. And this text sounds absolutely horrible to our Western modern ears. This is tantamount to child abuse. It's murder or human sacrifice. And it's desecration of a corpse. So yes, what's being talked about sounds horrific, and I want to say that up front. But as we lay down groundwork in hour 1, we do have to allow all of the relevant texts to speak to this issue. And I'm going to just say up front, Genesis 22 cannot be divorced from the rest of the story, especially from the rest of the Genesis narrative, from the Abrahamic narrative, and we have to read it in its context. Now, again, the offering of Isaac is Genesis chapter 22, keeping in mind that the chapter breaks were added much later than the original composition of the text. The Abrahamic narrative really begins with Genesis chapter 12, and we'll come to that more a little bit later. But Genesis chapter 12, I believe the author assumes that before you get to what we call 22, the section that we identify as chapter 22, you've already read chapter 12. You already know what has happened before this episode in 22. And that will inform your understanding of 22. We'll get into that a little bit more. We also have to keep in mind chapter 15 verse 4 that the child of promise would come from Abraham's own body. Chapter 15 is where God and Abraham have a conversation, and although Abraham acknowledges that God has indeed blessed him, he points out that he doesn't have an heir to inherit that blessing. And God says that a child from his body, from Abraham's body, will be his heir. Chapter 16, the birth of Ishmael. And the birth of Ishmael is an important text regarding chapter 22 and regarding the entirety of Scripture. And one thing is, once again, by the time you get to what we call 22, you've already read the rest of the story. And you should be hearing themes. You should be hearing and noticing certain things are kind of repeating themselves in certain ways that you should pick up. You should realize, wait a minute, this text is similar to what I've already read. Chapter 16, verse 3, Sarai, her name would be changed later, Sarai took Hagar. And the idea of she took, that should bring to our mind Genesis chapter 3, verse 6. She in this case being Eve, took from the fruit going back to 16, and gave her to her husband, similar to chapter 3, verse 6, and she gave also to her husband. Now I have to admit that the emphasis here is mine, but those words are being repeated from chapter 3, the fall of man, to chapter 16. Now God never commanded Abraham to do this, to take Hagar as a wife. And I don't believe that you ever see in Scripture God approving of this polygamy. Chapter 21, verse 12, God refers to Hagar as your maid. God has referred to Sarah as Abraham's wife. He never refers to Hagar as his wife. Chapter 16 is a misuse of Abraham's body. It's a misuse of sex, and it's a misuse of procreation. The way God meant for Abraham's body to be used, the way God meant for sex to be used, and what God intended for procreation. In some cases, the Bible is descriptive and not prescriptive. That is to say that the text tells us what did happen, how it happened, what led to it happening. It's not saying that this happened and it was ideal. We've already covered that Jesus even thought about certain commands from God as not being the ideal. For example, the book of Judges. The entire book of Judges is a terrific example of descriptive, not prescriptive, actions by the Israelites. And so chapter 16, I believe, is a descriptive chapter, not a prescriptive chapter. Chapter 17 is another text that should inform us regarding our interpretation of 22. Genesis chapter 17 is the covenant of circumcision, and it can be broken down into verses 1b through 2, that would be the covenant, verses 9 through 14, that circumcision would be the sign. Verses 15 through 21, Sarai's name is going to be changed to Sarah, and the child from Abraham and Sarah, that would be Isaac, is in fact the child of promise. Verse 19 is a rejection of Ishmael as the child of promise. Now, it's not a total rejection of Ishmael, but it is a rejection of Ishmael as the child of promise. And that's very important because God is also rejecting human attempts to bring about God's promises. Chapter 16 is just that. Man, human, has decided that they have to bring about God's promises. And in so doing, you have polygamy. In so doing, you have the birth of Ishmael. And in so doing, you have human attempt to force God's promise. And here is God's rejection of that force. And then verses 22 through 27 would be the actual circumcision. Notice that the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was put on a specific part of Abraham. That is his progenitive part, his part for procreation. Abraham's body, then, his entire body, was, after being submitted to the sign, was then in full submission to God. Hey all, Pastor Ozzy here. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it helpful, feel free to share it. And if you want more, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and you'll be notified when new videos are available. Again, thank you so much.